Now, I want to cross down to Melbourne, where we're about to be joined by the Federal Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
Look, I want to come to your portfolio issues in just a moment, but first up, when it comes to internal Liberal Party politics, you've pre-selected a new candidate to replace Kelly O'Dwyer in the federal seat of Higgins. The pre-selections occurred tonight, and hallelujah, you must be relieved. The party members of Higgins have chosen a woman. Her name is Katie Ellis. She's a paediatrician.
Katie Allen, indeed, Chris, and she's an outstanding candidate, and she will work hard to deliver for the people of Higgins. She's a professor of paediatrics at the University of Melbourne and also at the Royal Children's. She's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, and she's been a local for 40 years and is on the board of a local school and a local hospital. So I think Katie will really put up a very good show at the upcoming federal election. She's an outstanding candidate, and the Liberal Party is proud to have her representing them in Higgins.
Apparently she ran in the state seat of Prahran at the state election just last year and obviously failed there. So the electorate, many of the voters in the electorate have had a look at her already and obviously not voted for her. That's a bit of a risk federally, isn't it?
Well, they're very different electorates, really. The state electorate of Prahran and the federal electorate of Higgins. Yes, there is overlap, and you're right that there are a lot of voters of Prahran within the federal electorate of Higgins, but that seat has not been held by the Liberal Party for a little while in Prahran, whereas, as you know, Kelly O'Dwyer has strongly held the seat of Higgins. But she's an outstanding candidate and she'll do very well.
Look, there's a ridiculous amount of focus, particularly from your political enemies, on identity politics these days and gender when it comes to the Liberal Party. People railing against another pre-selection in Perth over the weekend because a man happened to win, as if men are no longer welcome in Parliament, which is silly. You've got to make sure that it's the best candidate. But nonetheless, of course, you do have a very, very poor representation of women. You need to lift your numbers. In other words, you do have what they call a woman problem. And the issue is with Julie Bishop retiring now and Kelly O'Dwyer, you know, losing two cabinet minister level women, it's only going to exacerbate the situation in the short term, isn't it?
Well, Julie and Kelly will be losses to the team, there's no doubt about that. And we all pay credit to their fantastic work as ministers and as local members. And Julie, is the deputy leader of the party for 11 years and an outstanding foreign minister, was really well regarded right across the community, and so too with Kelly. She's been a trailblazer and has made some very significant policy changes, particularly with her Women's Economic Security Statement that they put out this year, as well as in a number of other areas. So they will be missed. But we also have a number of very strong female representatives in our coalition team. And I'm just thinking the work recently being done by Linda Reynolds in the flood-ravaged areas of Queensland, where she's been bringing her military experience to bear and has been taking charge up there, doing a fantastic job. Sarah Henderson, who's doing important work in disabilities and in other areas, and has fought hard to retain the trust of the people of Corangamite at successive elections. And then in Cabinet, obviously Michaela Cash and Melissa Price and Karen Andrews.
Well, Melissa Price we hardly hear from, and we don't really know why, because she's got a high-level portfolio in the environment. And Michaela Cash we don't hear much from, but we know that because she's under siege on these union investigation issues.
Well, no, I'd say to you that Melissa is working hard on a whole range of fronts in that important environment portfolio, the one that I held before this one. And so too with Michaela.
When you're Environment Minister, we saw a lot more of you than we're seeing of Melissa Price. She doesn't seem to be interested in... She doesn't seem to be so interested in making the case publicly about how your government is reducing emissions and looking after all the other environmental issues in this country.
Oh, and we are. But I also had the energy portfolio as well as the environment portfolio. And as you know now, that is held by two separate cabinet ministers.
Well, speaking of energy, let's talk about coal. We know there's been this problem with getting coal into some Chinese ports. A lot of toing and froing as to whether this is diplomatic payback or not, as if China would ever say so up front. What are the economic implications of this? Is it slowing revenue to Australia? Is it slowing the tax take for you from our record coal exports, which have been a real bonus for the budget?
Well, I wouldn't be jumping to conclusions on this. In fact, I'd be saying that the trading relationship between China and Australia is very strong, very important to both countries and very healthy. If you look at our coal exports to China in the last quarter of 2018, they were higher in both value and volume than they were in the same quarter in 2017. And our exports are worth more than $60 billion a year, and the coal industry creates more than 50,000 jobs. In fact, the attention really should be on the Labor Party, who have tied themselves in knots over the issue over the last week and previously, because they're stuck between their heart and their head on this issue. They know how important our coal exports are to creating jobs, particularly in regional communities, and many jobs for the Indigenous community, but also for the export income that it generates that leads us to be able to put more money into schools, hospitals and roads and infrastructure. So the coal industry is an important part of our resources sector, and unfortunately Bill Shorten, as we've seen before, is trying to walk both sides of the street. He'll say one thing to the baristas of Batman in Melbourne and another thing to the miners of Mackay in Queensland. So we are very consistent with our message, which is that coal is an important part of the energy mix and will be so for some time to come.
Yeah, well, it's undeniable. If it's our #1 export and most of our electricity comes from it, it's pretty hard to play it down, and especially when you've got companies wanting to invest in more coal. They obviously have markets for it, which brings me to the Rocky River mine that was proposed in New South Wales near Gloucester, metallurgical coal to be exported from that particular mine. But you must be gravely concerned that the New South Wales Land and Environment Court judgment actually cited climate change concerns and global emissions concerns in knocking back a mine. I mean, this is a signal to overseas investors that you cannot invest in coal in Australia.
Well, we continue to welcome foreign investment in our resources sector, and as I said, we continue to export coal around the world because it's an important part
Sure, but you must be
of our energy
alarmed
mix.
that a state court can cite climate policy for actually stopping a project.
But I also note that there was an unsuccessful case which tried to do the same vis-a-vis the Adani mine in Queensland. So I think the focus needs to be on the environmental impacts of a particular resource project, whatever that resource may be, and it's done under the EPBC Act, and that has very strict parameters to it.
Now, tell us about our emissions reductions targets. There was the modelling released this week by Brian Fisher, which talks about a $472 billion hit to the economy under Labor's doubling of emissions targets and all the flow-on effects to the economy. But, of course, there are very heavy costs with the policies you have on the table right at the moment. It's going to cost jobs, it's going to cost wages growth, and it's going to cost the national economy. Why are we doing this? Why are we imposing such a heavy cost on ourselves when global emissions are continuing to rise by an enormous factor, by twice of our total emissions?
Well, it's true that that modelling that was released by a very credible economist did expose the Labor Party for the damage that it will do if it's ever got a chance in government with its 45% emissions reduction target and 50% renewable energy target, because the impact on jobs, particularly those in manufacturing and aluminium, in steel, in chemicals, in paper, energy-intensive industries will be very immense, but also the impact it's going to have on wages. So jobs, wages and electricity prices, all of which will go up under the Labor Party. And indeed, the Business Council of Australia has described Labor's targets as being a wrecking ball through the economy. In contrast, I think we've got the balance right in our 26 to 28% emissions reduction target. We will meet and beat that target just as we did for the first Kyoto target, and just as we are on track to do so with the 2020 target. But we've got a much more balanced approach, much more considered approach, Chris, whereas the Labor Party is all about ideology and is all about virtue signalling without coming clean to the Australian public with the real costs of their policies.
Yeah, but we're still left with just the mind-numbing inanity of imposing this cost on ourselves while the global emissions continue to rise. I mean, why should Australia be harming itself when the rest of the world is going ahead and having a merry old time and increasing its emissions and therefore its economic prosperity? It just doesn't make sense. No matter how we would like the world to be, how much we would like the world to reduce emissions, it's not happening. So why are we the country that seems to be doing itself more economic damage than any other country on the planet in order to deliver these climate goals?
Well, I'd say to you, Chris, that emissions are now the lowest on a per capita and GDP basis in 28 years. But we are doing that in a sort of considered and balanced way. We're not going to subject the Australian people to a 45% emissions reduction target or a 50% renewable energy target. There is a transition that's taking place in the energy sector. There is more intermittent sources of power that is coming in, and we need to provide the backup and the storage, because you see when state governments particularly get it wrong, like they did in South Australia, the exposure to those states and the cost to those states is immense, both in business confidence as well as the real hit to the economy. In contrast, we think we've got the balance right. We're going about it in a measured way. We have a series of policies, and yes, there are financial costs to some of these investments, but in the long term, that's what we do to meet our international commitments.
All right, Josh Frydenberg, you've got a big battle going on with Labor on taxation issues, especially Labor's proposed changes on negative gearing and franking credits. Now, watching this play out between you and Shadow Treasurer and former Treasurer Chris Bowen, I just get the sense here that this is much more than a political contest between you two. This is really personal. He's out there attacking you personally day in, day out, and likewise, you really want to get under his skin. You're both after each other's scalps here, aren't you?
I'm actually on the side of the Australian people here, and I'm only after a better deal for them. And what I don't want to see is that the Australian people get subject to $200 billion of new taxes, which is the real genius of the Labor Party. Somehow they think that if they can slug Australians for $200 billion of extra taxes, that will somehow create more jobs, higher economic growth and more prosperity. Well, the history shows you that is exactly what won't happen. The reality is, when it comes to, for example, franking credits and the changes that were put in place there, or being proposed there by the Labor Party, is that we've had 2 decades of a bipartisan consensus. And Simon Crean, when he supported this as Shadow Treasurer for the Labor Party back in the year 2000, he said it would support lower income earners and retirees, and it has done exactly that. Now, Chris Bowen, under a huge amount of pressure, went out and said that the Australian people who don't like this policy, well, they can go and vote against the Labor Party. Well, that showed enormous hubris and arrogance, and it was very dismissive of the concerns of the people who are really worried about it. And Chris Bowen has doubled down, Chris, ever since that statement. When he did an interview last week with the 7:30 report, he was asked by Leigh Sales, will there be any tweaks? Will there be any changes? He said, absolutely not. So there's only one side of politics, that's our side of politics under Scott Morrison, who are going to stand by retirees and keep the law as it is and allow people who have planned for retirement to actually continue in retirement with these benefits that they get from the franking credits. And the same could be said about negative gearing and capital gains tax. Chris Bowen wants to give Australians the highest capital gains tax nearly anywhere in the world, higher than the UK, higher than the US, higher than New Zealand, higher than in Canada. And well, it really will be crushing aspiration and indeed job creation.
Will you then guarantee, will the coalition guarantee, do you personally guarantee that if you were to be re-elected, that the next term there would be not a single change to laws affecting superannuation and retirement incomes or to housing investments? Just absolutely guarantee no changes to any of those arrangements?
Look, we're not seeking to make changes to those arrangements, and we do recognise that people need stability and consistency in policy to plan for their retirement. And I can tell you that the housing market has seen a bit of a fall, And that means that this is actually quite a delicate time in the housing market. And the Labor Party came up with their policy on negative gearing at a time of rising housing prices. So their policy will only do one thing. It will only see the value of the family home go down, and it will see rents go up.
Sure.
And that is not the right time for this policy.
Can you just rule out any changes in the whole first term, the next term of the government, should it be re-elected? No changes to any of those negative gearing arrangements or retirement incomes and superannuation changes?
We're certainly not planning to change
Sure, but can you rule it out? Can you tell people that they'll have a whole term of government where no one fiddles with any of this?
Well, Chris, I can tell you that the Liberal Party knows when it comes to a retirees tax, or when it comes to negative gearing or capital gains.
But you fiddled in this term. You fiddled with superannuation in this term. Ask Kelly O'Dwyer all about that.
Chris,
retirees and investors would love a term of government with no changes in these areas.
Well, I can tell you that the coalition under Scott Morrison is on their side. Is on the side of retirees, is on the side of people planning for the retirement. I mean, when you look at the retirees tax from the Labor Party, it's predominantly going to hurt women. Over 50% of those affected are women, and of those women, 2/3 are over the age of 60 and half are widowed or single. I mean, this is actually going to really hit those people who have a low taxable income, particularly under $37,000. And it's going to be very punishing for these people, particularly because they can't change their retirement plans so late in their careers and late in life.
I just want to get to population quickly before we let you go, Treasurer. Of course, your big focus now, Parliament's done until you get back for the budget. No pressure on you. Of course, we're expecting you to deliver a budget with a realistic forecast of a surplus, the first one for a decade, but also you're expected to deliver a budget that will give the government a chance of re-election, so your colleagues are pinning all their hopes on you. But population, our immigration numbers are part of the budget framework. You've got Tony Abbott, now the former Prime Minister, openly running a petition on his own government to lower the official rate of immigration in this country. And David Coleman, the Immigration Minister, told me on radio on Friday night that effectively Scott Morrison has already talked about a 30,000 people cut in our permanent migrant intake in the coming year. Can you confirm that that sort of number is going to be contained in the budget?
Well, as David said, the Prime Minister has already talked about bringing that number down. And our focus really is on managing the population change. You see, back in 2002, when the intergenerational report was done, there was an expectation that Australia would hit 25 million people by 2040. Well, we hit that target last year, and the population's been growing much faster than anyone thought it would, and 2/3 of that growth has been either in Sydney, Melbourne or southeast Queensland, and this is creating real challenges. I've seen it, firsthand in Melbourne, whether it's on public transport infrastructure, or in schools, or in hospitals. It really puts pressure on the infrastructure. So we need a better plan. We need greater coordination with the states, because our population growth at 1.7% is the 5th fastest in the OECD, and much faster than it was in the 80s and 90s. So what we're really focused on is the right infrastructure spending, encouraging people to move to the regions where there are lots of jobs, and ensuring we get the balance right, where immigration, which has served this country so well, and I'm a proud product of immigration to this country, and I think it brings great diversity and strength to our community. But at the same time, we need to manage that population change by investing in the infrastructure that we need to serve Australia for decades to come.
So we can expect a budget time announcement of about a 30,000 reduction in our permanent migrant intake.
Well, obviously the Prime Minister's talked about that number, but we'll wait for the budget. But one thing I can tell your viewers tonight about the budget is that it will be in surplus. It'll be the first surplus in over a decade. We've got strong economic growth. Unemployment's down the lowest level in 8 years. And of course, we've created more than 1.2 million new jobs.
You go back to writing your budget speech. We're here on Budget Night. Thanks so much for joining us, Josh Frydenberg.
Good to be with you, my friend.